Sam&Cents. Money that finally makes sense. Two strangers. One was educated at elite schools, ran a major business for one of the biggest names on Wall Street, and worked from a corner office. The other pumped gas in a small Vermont town, mopped floors at J.C. Penney, and held his winter coat together with a safety pin. Now imagine you have to hand one of them your retirement, everything you'll live on when you stop working. Be honest, you've already chosen, and you just picked wrong. By the end of this story, you'll know exactly why you picked wrong, and why the same reason may be quietly working against your own money right now. Here's the puzzle this episode solves. How does a man who never earned a big salary in his life die with about $8 million, while a man who was paid millions loses his house? The answer is not intelligence, it is not income. It comes down to a small set of behaviors, and one number in particular that you can compute for yourself this week, in about 5 minutes, with your own bank statement. Keep that promise in mind. First, the two lives. Life 1. Ronald Read, born in 1921 in Dummerston, Vermont. He grew up poor, served in the Second World War, and came home to a working life that never once looked impressive on paper. For about 25 years he ran a gas station with his brother, pumping gas and fixing cars. Then, in what most people call retirement, he worked about 17 more years as a part-time janitor and maintenance man at the local J.C. Penney. He drove used cars, he chopped his own firewood, and when his flannel coat wore through, he didn't buy a new one. He closed it with a safety pin. Here's what almost nobody knew. Every day Ronald read the Wall Street Journal. With the money left over from that modest life, he bought stock. Boring, dividend-paying blue-chip companies spread across many different industries, banks, utilities, railroads, consumer brands. When his estate was finally counted, it held at least 95 different stocks. He kept the paper certificates in a safe deposit box at the bank. When those companies paid dividends, he didn't spend the checks, he bought more shares, and then he did the hardest thing in investing. For decades, through booms and through crashes, he mostly did nothing at all. Life 2. On the other side of the split screen, a former senior Merrill Lynch executive, a man who once headed the firm's Latin America business. We're not going to use his name, and later I'll tell you exactly why. What matters is the shape of the life. Educated at elite schools, decades at the top of Wall Street, compensation most of us will never see. If the janitor's life was built on what he kept, this life was built on what it displayed, and by every scoreboard our culture uses, life 2 was winning by a landslide. The centerpiece of that life was the house. According to press coverage from 2010, it was a mansion of 18,471 square feet, as listed that year, sitting on 14 acres, with 2 swimming pools, 2 elevators, and a 7-car garage. Hold that image, because this house is not just scenery. It is the whole mechanism of this story, sitting in plain sight. A house like that isn't only expensive to buy, it is expensive to keep, every single month forever, whether the money is still coming in or not. Then came 2008. And the financial crisis. In his bankruptcy declaration, the executive wrote, quote, "I have been personally devastated by the financial crisis which came to a head in March 2008. End quote. In April 2010, he filed for personal bankruptcy, halting a foreclosure auction that had been scheduled on that 14-acre mansion. Court filings indicated no income. The house was later lost in a distressed sale. A man who had run part of one of the most powerful banks on earth could not keep his own home. And I want to be careful here. This is not a story about a fool. Nothing about this man was stupid. That's precisely what should worry you." 4 years later, the other door opened. In June 2014, Ronald Read died in Brattleboro, Vermont, at 92 years old. And then his town found out who he had actually been. His estate came to about $8 million. He left $4.8 million to Brattleboro Memorial Hospital and $1.2 million to the Brooks Memorial Library, the largest gifts either had ever received, with roughly $2 million more going to his stepchildren and friends. The man everyone assumed was poor had been quietly one of the wealthiest people in town. Now, 2 honest notes before the autopsy. First, these 2 men never met, and nobody compared them while they lived. It was the author Morgan Housel who later placed these 2 lives side by side in his book, The Psychology of Money. The pairing is his insight. The lives are simply real. Second, why no name for the executive? because he is a living private citizen, and the popular retellings of his story get basic details about him wrong. So we've kept only what the court record and the press record support, and left his name out. The lesson doesn't need it. So, the autopsy. Why did the janitor end up rich, not stock-picking genius? Ronald Read's edge was made of duller things, a savings rate, a modest life that cost far less than even a modest income, decade after decade. Time, roughly 65 years of compounding, because he started young and never cashed out. Reinvested dividends, so the money made money that made money. And nerve, he held through crash after crash. He was not perfect, and here's the proof. He held Lehman Brothers stock, and in 2008 it went to zero. He took that punch. But because he was spread across at least 95 companies, 1-0 could not sink him. Diversification absorbed the hit. And now the caveat this whole episode is honor bound to say out loud. We only hear about Ronald Read because his strategy worked. There is an invisible graveyard of frugal, disciplined investors who picked individual stocks and lost. What's replicable is the savings rate, the holding period, and broad diversification, not the outcome. Add to that, Read compounded through a historic American bull market. That was a tailwind, and future returns may differ. So no, I am not telling you that anyone who pins their coat shut and buys dividend stocks ends up with $8 million. I'm telling you which parts of his story transfer, and which part was the era's gift, and why did the executive go broke? Not stupidity, remember that's the comfortable answer, and it's wrong. The mechanism was structural. His fixed costs, the mansion, the staff, the lifestyle, were calibrated to his very best years of income. His wealth was concentrated and illiquid, enormously valuable on paper, nearly impossible to turn into cash in a hurry, and carrying debt against it. So when the crisis came, the structure could not bend, there was no margin for a single bad stretch, and 2008 was a very bad stretch. Which brings us to the line this whole story sharpens: income is what you're paid, wealth is what you keep, and compound. Let's put the janitor's engine on the bench, with made-up transparent numbers, not his real account. Say you invest $300 a month every month for 40 years, and the market returns an assumed 7% a year, compounded monthly. Over those 40 years you would deposit $144,000 of your own money, but the ending balance would be roughly $787,000. Read that gap again. Only $144,000 came from you, the rest, more than $600,000, is compounding. Money earned by money you earned earlier. That's an illustration, with every assumption on screen. It is not a guarantee, and it is not Ronald Read's bank statement. But it is the machine he sat inside for 65 years. Now the bridges to your money, each one an analogy with its limits said out loud. Bridge 1. Read's stocks lived as paper certificates in a safe deposit box, and his dividends arrived as checks. That friction accidentally protected him. Selling was a trip to the bank, so he mostly didn't. Your brokerage lives in your pocket, and selling takes one tap. Ownership compounds exactly the same way it did in 1960, but the guardrail is gone. So the modern move is deliberate. Automate the buying and put friction back on the selling. Bridge 2 in one sentence. Read diversified by hand across at least 95 stocks, and reinvested every dividend. Today a single broad, low-cost total market fund does that same job in one instrument, and it's the diversification, not the picking, that transfers. And Bridge 3 is the stress test. Read could hold through 2008, even while eating a Lehman Zero, for one unglamorous reason: he never needed to sell. Holding through a crash only works if a cash buffer means you're never forced to sell at the bottom. Without that buffer, just hold on is not a strategy, it's a hope. Last bridge, the mansion. You will probably never own a house with 2 elevators, but the executive's mechanism scales down perfectly. His fixed costs were set against his best case income. When income fell, the costs didn't. Your version is rent, or a mortgage, a car payment, debt service, and the subscriptions that auto-renew whether you're thriving or not. A common budgeting rule of thumb says that when those fixed monthly commitments climb past roughly 50 to 60% of your take-home pay, your structure is getting rigid. That's a rule of thumb, not a law, not a magic threshold. But the mechanism it points at is the one that took down a Wall Street executive. fixed costs calibrated to your best case life. So here's your Tuesday, 4 moves all this week. 1. Compute your savings rate. Income minus all spending divided by income. That number, the one I promised you at the start, was Ronald Read's real edge, and it is the single dial in this whole story you fully control. 2. Compute that fixed cost ratio we just built, using the rule of thumb lens. 3. Automate one recurring investment into a broad, diversified, low-cost instrument, and write down on paper the only conditions under which you'll sell. A date or a goal, never a headline. 4. Build or protect the cash buffer, so the next 2008 never gets to force your hand. One more witness so you know Ronald Read isn't a one-off. Grace Groner, a secretary at Abbott Laboratories, bought $180 of her company's stock in 1935 and never sold. By her death in 2010, it had grown into a gift of about $7 million to Lake Forest College. Same engine, time, reinvested dividends, and a life that cost less than it earned. One warning though, her fortune rode a single stock. That's concentration risk. It happened to work, and it is exactly what you should not copy. The pattern that repeats is the behavior. The diversification part, Read did better. Before we close, the boundary, plainly. This has been a true story and a set of general principles. It is not personalized financial advice. Your taxes, your account types, your debts, and your own risk capacity can all change what's right for you, and a real plan accounts for them. What history can give you is the mechanism. 2 real Americans rode the same markets through the same century. One structure compounded quietly for 65 years, the other was magnificent, rigid, and broke exactly once, which was all it took. So, back to the bet. 2 strangers. You picked the corner office because our eyes are trained on income, and income is the loudest, least important number in this story. The janitor's secret wasn't a secret at all. Spend less than you earn, own broadly, reinvest, hold for decades, and keep your fixed costs humble enough to survive your worst year. That's it. That's the whole $8 million trick. And the parts of it that transfer are yours for free starting Tuesday. And if you think you'd never fall for the loudest number in the room, next time, meet the man who built the loudest number in American history. Boston, 1920. He promised to grow your money 50% in 45 days, and half the city believed him. That's next time. Same channel. Bring your skepticism. So there it is, small boring moves that quietly win. If your money makes a little more sense now, hit subscribe to Sam&Cents. And the next one's right here. It picks up right where this leaves off. See you there.